The call came from a 310 area code on a Tuesday afternoon in September, and I knew what they wanted before the woman on the other end finished introducing herself. She said the name of her production company, Meridian Content, or Meridian something, and asked if I was the Nora Cahill who operated charter boats out of Gannett Harbor, and I said I was. She asked if I was familiar with the waters around Greyhaven Island, and I almost laughed. I was sitting on the dock at the time, looking directly at Greyhaven. I've looked at it nearly every day of my 37 years on this earth. The island sits about 4 miles off the coast, a dark hump of spruce and granite that catches the morning fog and holds it like a fist. The ferry runs to the western landing twice a day in summer, once in winter. Lobster boats work the channels to the north and south. And to the east, past the rocky point where the old lighthouse foundation still crumbles into the tide, there's a stretch of open water about 2 miles long and a mile wide that nobody goes near. That's what they wanted. That's always what they want, eventually. I told the woman no. I said I wasn't available, that my schedule was booked through October, which wasn't true. She was polite about it. She said they'd find another operator and thanked me for my time. I hung up and sat there watching the light move on the water east of Greyhaven, the same water I've watched my entire life, and I felt the thing I always feel when someone from away starts asking about the stretch, which isn't fear exactly. It's the feeling you get when you hear a storm warning for a storm you can see coming, not surprise, not panic, just the weight of knowing you have to do something and not yet knowing what. I should explain what the stretch is, or at least what it does, because I've never had the luxury of not knowing. Some people in Gannett Harbor can remember a time before they understood. I can't. I was 7 years old the first time I saw what it takes from people, and I've been living with that knowledge ever since, the way you live with a bad knee or a difficult neighbor. It's not a mystery to me. It's a condition. The stretch of water off Greyhaven's eastern shore removes things from you. Not physical things, it doesn't sink boats or drown swimmers. It's more precise than that. It takes memories. Skills. Pieces of who you are. The longer you're in it, the more it takes, and it doesn't give anything back. Brief exposure, a few minutes, and you might lose a handful of specific memories. The name of your third-grade teacher. The taste of your grandmother's bread. Things you might not even notice are gone until you reach for them. Longer exposure takes more hours in the stretch and you'll lose categories, how to read, how to tie your shoes, how to feel afraid. And if you stay long enough, it takes everything above the autonomic. Your heart will beat and your lungs will breathe and your eyes will track movement, and that's all. Everything that made you a person will be gone. Not replaced by something else. Just gone. Like a house with the lights off and nobody home. I know how that sounds. I know how it would have sounded to me if I hadn't grown up with it, if I hadn't watched it happen. That's the problem, actually. That's always been the problem. The day after the phone call, I drove 40 minutes up the coast to Haverbrook to see my father. He's in an assisted living place there, not because his mind is going, at least not the way it usually goes at 74. His mind is sharp. He does the crossword every morning in pen, he reads histories of naval warfare, he argues with the staff about the Red Sox with a specificity that borders on prosecutorial. He just can't live alone anymore because of his hip, and because the house in Gannett Harbor has too many stairs, and because I couldn't watch him fall one more time without doing something about it. He was in the sunroom when I arrived, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold. There was a photograph on the table next to him, one I recognized, because I'd seen it in our house my entire childhood. It showed a woman standing on a dock in a yellow raincoat, laughing at something off camera. I knew the woman was my mother because I'd been told she was. My father didn't know that. He picked up the photo when he saw me looking at it and said, "One of the nurses found this in a box I hadn't unpacked. Pretty woman. No idea who she is." He said it casually. That's the thing that gets people who haven't seen it before, the casualness. There's no anguish, no sense of loss. You can't miss what you don't remember having. My father knows, in an intellectual sense, that he was married to a woman named Ellen Cahill for 12 years. He's seen the marriage certificate. He's heard me talk about her. But the knowledge is purely factual, like knowing the capital of Mongolia. He has no emotional connection to it whatsoever, because every memory of Ellen, her face, her voice, the way she took her coffee, the day they met, the day they married, the 1,000 ordinary days in between, was removed from him cleanly and completely 30 years ago, when he walked into the stretch for 11 minutes to help pull a Coast Guard rescue boat back to safe water. My mother was alive then. She came home from her sister's house in Portsmouth to find her husband looking at her the way you'd look at a stranger in a grocery store, polite, blank, waiting for context. She tried for 3 years. She showed him photos, told him stories, reenacted their first date in the living room of their own house. Nothing took. The memories weren't suppressed or blocked. They were absent. There was nothing to recover. She left when I was 10. I don't blame her. I don't think she blamed him either. There's no one to blame. The stretch doesn't have intentions. It's not cruel. It's not anything. It just does what it does, the way gravity does what it does, and my father walked into it because people were in trouble and he was the harbor master and that was his job. He wasn't the worst case. That would be Gerald Kopp. Gerald was a lobsterman, 41 years old, strong, sharp, well-liked. He'd been checking traps too close to the eastern boundary when the original incident happened. His boat drifted into the stretch during a current shift, and by the time the Coast Guard got their rescue boat out there, Gerald had been inside for the better part of a day. The 2 Coast Guard crew who went in after him were exposed for maybe 40 minutes. They came back diminished, lost chunks of their pasts, one of them forgot how to drive, the other couldn't recognize his own sister for a week and never fully relearned her name, but they were still themselves. They could still hold a conversation, make choices, feel things. Gerald came back empty. He's still alive. He's 68 years old and he sits in a recliner in a house on Maple Street that the town maintains through a fund no one talks about. His sister Donna and a rotation of volunteers feed him, bathe him, change his clothes. His body is healthy. His eyes are open and they track movement. If you wave your hand in front of his face, his gaze follows it. If you put a spoon to his lips, his mouth opens. But there's no one in there. Not a damaged person, not a confused person. No person at all. A body running on automatic. I've sat with him. Everyone in Gannett Harbor who knows about the stretch has sat with him at least once. It's the reason we keep the secret. Gerald is the lesson. After the incident, the Coast Guard investigated. Quietly. They sent a team with instruments and cameras into the stretch, and the instruments recorded nothing anomalous, normal salinity, normal temperature, normal depth, and the cameras came back with empty footage. Not corrupted, not overexposed. The files were there, the timestamps were there, the frame count was right, but every frame showed flat gray water and nothing else. You can't document it. You can't prove it to anyone who hasn't been in it. The only evidence is the people who come back less, and their diminished state is, conveniently, the very thing that makes them unreliable witnesses. The Coast Guard understood this. They reclassified the stretch as a navigational hazard, submerged rocks, unpredictable currents, and adjusted their patrol routes to exclude it entirely. If you pull their maritime activity data for the area around Greyhaven, there's a void. A perfect blank spot where no Coast Guard vessel has operated in 3 decades. They didn't announce this. They just stopped going. The town made the same calculation. We maintain a line of marker buoys along the boundary, spaced to look like lobster pot markers. We run a volunteer watch rotation during tourist season. We intercept kayakers and pleasure boaters with friendly warnings about rocks and rips. It works, mostly. Every few years someone slips through, and if we reach them fast enough, they lose only small things, a few memories, a skill or 2. When we don't reach them in time, we get another person like Gerald, and the town absorbs them, cares for them, and says nothing. I told my father about the phone call. He listened without interrupting, which is his way. When I finished, he set the photograph of my mother back on the table, face up, the way you'd set down a card you didn't need. "They'll come regardless," he said. "You know that." "I know. Have you remeasured lately?" I had. Last month. I'd taken the makeweight, my 34-foot down east, the boat I use for charters, out to the eastern boundary and cross-referenced the marker buoys against the GPS coordinates I keep in my head. I don't write them down. Nothing written survives inside the stretch with its content intact, and I've gotten into the habit of keeping the important numbers in memory, refreshed monthly like a password. The boundary had moved. Not by much, maybe 30, 35 meters outward from where it had been a year ago. But it had moved. It's been moving since we started measuring. Roughly 30 meters per year, expanding in every direction like a slow breath. At that rate, it reaches the ferry route in about 15 years. The town dock in 20. Then you know what's coming, my father said. Not today. But coming. I drove back to Gannet Harbor thinking about math. About how many years I had before the stretch made the whole question academic, and how many outside people with cameras and curiosity I'd have to deal with in the meantime. The crew showed up 3 days later, a full day ahead of when the production company said they'd arrive. I spotted them at Kathy's, the restaurant on the harbor, identifiable the way out-of-towners always are, clean boots, new rain jackets in colors no working fisherman would buy, the particular restless energy of people who've come to a small place to extract something from it. There were 3 of them. 2 men and a woman, with hard-sided camera cases stacked next to their booth. The one who approached me at the dock that afternoon introduced himself as Mark Adler. Mid-30s, dark hair, easy smile, the kind of charisma that comes from genuine confidence rather than performance. He told me he produced a web series called Off the Chart, which investigated locations where government agencies behaved strangely, places that had been quietly reclassified, removed from maps, or excluded from routine operations without public explanation. He said someone from his team had pulled the Coast Guard's maritime activity data for the past 30 years and found a void around Greyhaven's eastern shore. He said the navigational advisory on record, submerged rocks, hazardous currents, didn't match any geological survey of the area. He thought it was probably an illegal military dump site or a classified testing zone. He wanted to take a boat out there and film it. He was warm about it. Direct. Not smug or adversarial. He said he'd heard I'd turned down their charter request, and he understood, and he wasn't trying to pressure me, but would I at least tell him why? I told him there was nothing out there. Bad currents, just like the advisory said. He smiled at that like I'd confirmed something and said they'd already rented a boat from a marina in Keniston, 2 towns up the coast. They were going regardless. I liked Mark. That's the part one want to be clear about. He wasn't reckless. Neither were the other 2, Suki Paik, his camera operator, who was quiet and watchful and carried her equipment like a violinist carries an instrument, or Dean Hirsch, their researcher and sound man, who had the kind of open, eager face that made you want to tell him things. They were competent, experienced, genuinely curious. They'd done this before, in places where the answer turned out to be mundane, and they'd reported their findings honestly. They weren't conspiracy cranks or thrill seekers. They were professionals. That's what made it so much worse. I tried everything I could think of over the next 2 days. I told Mark there was nothing to find. He pointed out that the Coast Guard had been avoiding the area for 30 years, which is an Every approach I tried made them more certain there was a story. My resistance was, to them, the most compelling evidence yet. If there were really nothing out there, why was I working so hard to keep them away? That evening I called an emergency meeting at the fire station. About 30 people came, the ones who know. The ones who maintain the buoys, run the watch rotation, take shifts feeding Gerald, keep the fund going. We've never had a formal organization or a name. We don't need one. In a town of 800 people, 30 is enough to cover the gaps, and the rest either don't know or know just enough not to ask questions. Ruth Gagnon got there first, because Ruth gets everywhere first. She's 62, owns the general store, and has opinions about everything with the specific confidence of someone who has been right about the weather more often than the weather service. She said we should tell the film crew everything. Lay it all out. Show them Gerald. If they understood what the stretch does, they'd have the basic human decency not to broadcast it. Pete Morrow, who's maintained the marker buoys for 15 years and has the sunburned hands to prove it, said that was the single worst idea he'd ever heard. You tell a film crew there's a real secret, he said, and you haven't scared them off. You've just written their next 10 episodes. Nothing makes these people more excited than being told there's something they shouldn't see. So what, Pete? We let them drive their rental boat into it and come back like Gerald? That's your plan? Didn't say I had a plan. Said yours was bad. Donna Kopp, Gerald's sister, was sitting in the back row with her coat still on, the way she always sits at meetings, like she might need to leave suddenly. She said, quietly, let them go. The room went still. They'll come back the way Gerald came back, and then they'll have their proof and they won't be able to do a damn thing with it. Jim Falk, the town selectman, suggested we contact the Coast Guard and let them handle it. Someone, I think it was Pete, laughed at that, and Jim got red-faced and said he didn't see anyone else offering solutions. Then Mike Brenton started talking about his property taxes, which had nothing to do with anything but was the thing Mike Brenton always talked about at town meetings. And Carl Wheeler's wife, Susan, asked whether the volunteers' liability insurance covered this sort of situation, and someone said what sort of situation, and Susan said, you know what sort, and the meeting dissolved into the kind of circular, bickering, deeply human mess that every small town meeting eventually becomes. I left without consensus. There was none to be had. Everyone in that room had a defensible position, and none of the positions were compatible, and the film crew was here right now and none of us could agree on what to do about it. The next morning I called the Coast Guard regional office in Boston. I was transferred 3 times. The first 2 people had clearly never heard of Greyhaven or the stretch or any navigational advisory associated with it. The third person had. I could tell by the pause. It was maybe 2 seconds long, but it had a quality to it, the quality of someone rapidly deciding how much to say. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, almost rehearsed. Ma'am, the navigational advisory for that area reflects current conditions and is updated as needed. I can't comment on specific operational decisions regarding patrol routes. I'm not asking about patrol routes, I said. I'm telling you there's a film crew here right now that's planning to take a boat into the area your people have been avoiding for 30 years, and I need to know if you're going to do anything about it. Another pause. Then, quieter, in a voice that didn't sound rehearsed at all, ma'am. We don't go there. You know why we don't go there. I can't help you with this. He hung up. I stood in my kitchen holding the phone and understood, clearly and finally, that there was no institutional backstop. The Coast Guard's solution to the stretch had always been the same as ours, avoidance. And avoidance, as a strategy, has an expiration date. That evening I was walking back to the dock from Kathy's when I ran into Dean Hirsch coming up the harbor ramp. He'd spent the afternoon on Greyhaven Island, on the eastern shore, the closest land to the stretch. He'd been taking soil samples and photographs. He hadn't been in the water, just on the rocks near it, walking the shoreline where the spray from the stretch could reach him. He was cheerful, excited about the samples he'd collected, talking fast the way he always did. Then he patted his pockets and frowned. Can't find my room key. I swear I had it when he checked his jacket, his jeans, his bag. Nothing. You probably left it on the rocks, I said. Maybe. He set his bag down and started going through it more carefully, and then he stopped and looked up at me. This is going to sound weird, but do you know where I parked? The rental car. I drove it this morning and I know I parked it somewhere on this street, but I'm looking at these cars and none of them. He trailed off, laughing at himself. Jet lag. God. We walked up the street together and found his rental, a silver Hyundai that he said looked vaguely familiar once I pointed it out. He thanked me, and then, halfway through unlocking the door, he paused again. Hey, Nora. What's the word for, you know, the little metal thing? The bent piece of wire that you use to hold papers together. A paperclip? He stared at me. Paperclip. Right. Yes. I could see it, I could see the shape of it, but the word just wasn't. He laughed again, shorter this time. Long day. I recognized the pattern. The small losses first, specific objects, specific words. Things you might attribute to fatigue or distraction if you didn't know better. Things that wouldn't alarm anyone who hadn't watched them happen before. Dean, I said. How long were you on the eastern shore? Few hours. I wasn't keeping track. Did you wade in at all? Even ankle deep? I mean, the tide was coming in, so my boots got wet a couple times. Why? I wanted to tell him. I wanted to say, this is what it does, this is how it starts, the small things go first and you explain them away and then the bigger things go and you can't explain them away because by then you've forgotten what explaining feels like. But I'd been having this argument with myself for 30 years, and I knew how it would sound to someone who'd lost a hotel key and a common word after a long day of fieldwork. It would sound crazy. It would sound like the kind of thing a paranoid local would say to scare off outsiders. He'd tell Mark, and Mark would add it to the file of evidence that Gannett Harbor was hiding something, and they'd be more determined than ever. Just be careful on those rocks, I said. The footing's bad. He drove off, and I stood on the street and made a decision. I called Mark that night and told him I wanted to show them something. He asked what, and I said it was easier to show than explain. I told him to bring Suki and Dean and to leave the cameras in the car. He hesitated at that but agreed. The next morning I drove them to Maple Street. To Gerald's house. Donna Kopp answered the door the way she always did, without surprise, because I'd called ahead. She led us through a clean, spare hallway, framed photos on the walls that Gerald couldn't see and wouldn't recognize, to the living room in the back. Gerald was in his recliner by the window. The curtains were open, letting in a gray September light. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and khaki pants. His hair was combed. His hands rested on the armrests, palms down. He looked, at first glance, like a man watching television, except the television wasn't on. His eyes were open and they moved, slow, tracking, the way a cat's eyes follow a bird, but there was nothing behind them. I've spent a lot of time trying to describe what that looks like, and the closest I've come is this: imagine looking at a photograph of someone's face, a high-quality photograph, perfectly sharp. Everything is there, the pores, the wrinkles, the light in the eyes. But it's flat. There's no one looking back at you. Gerald's face was like that, except it was three-dimensional and breathing. Dean stopped in the doorway. Suki stepped in slowly, as if the room itself required careful handling. Mark walked up to the recliner and looked at Gerald for a long moment, then looked at me. What happened to him? That's what I brought you here to see. Donna sat down across from Gerald, the way she always did, close enough to touch him if she needed to. She said, Gerald built boats. He could look at a piece of wood and tell you where it grew and how old it was and whether it would hold a keel. He read everything: history, novels, repair manuals, the back of cereal boxes. He had a voice you could hear across the harbor. She paused, and in the pause Gerald's eyes drifted to her face and then drifted away, tracking nothing. He went into the stretch, I said. I told them everything. Not dramatically, not desperately, I laid it out the way my father would have, like a weather report. The Coast Guard incident 30 years ago. The rescue boat. The crew who came back diminished. Gerald, who came back empty. My father, who went in for 11 minutes and lost every memory of my mother. The town's decision. The buoys, the watch rotation, the fund. The 30 years of silence. The expansion. I told them what the stretch does, the specific, progressive subtraction. Memory first, then skill, then recognition, then drive. I told them it affects recording equipment the same way it affects people, empties the content, leaves the container. I told them you can't document it, can't photograph it, can't record it. The only evidence is the people who come back less, and their condition is exactly the thing that discredits their testimony. When I finished, the room was quiet. Dean was looking at his hands with an expression I couldn't read, or maybe I could, and it was the expression of someone who had just lost a word for paperclip and was rethinking why. Suki hadn't lifted her camera once. She was watching Gerald. Mark said, "How do we know this isn't a medical condition? Early onset dementia, some kind of environmental toxin." He was 41, Donna said. And healthy. And it happened in an afternoon. All 4 of them, I added. Same day. Same water. No toxicology finding, no pathology finding. The Coast Guard ran every test they could. Normal results across the board, except the people weren't normal anymore. Mark was quiet for a while. He looked at Gerald again. Gerald's chest rose and fell. His eyes followed Mark's hand when Mark moved it, the way a plant follows sun, autonomic, indifferent, alive without being present. "Okay," Mark said, softly. Then he turned and walked out of the house, and the rest of us followed. I thought I'd done it. I thought the weight of Gerald, the sheer, physical, undeniable reality of a man who'd been sitting in that chair for 27 years with nobody inside him, would be enough. I thought they'd pack up and drive back to Los Angeles and never think about Greyhaven again. I was wrong in exactly the way Pete Morrow had warned me I'd be. Mark found me at the dock the next morning. He had a different energy, not reckless, not fearful. Focused. Intense. The energy of someone who's just realized the scale of what they've stumbled into. "Nora," he said. "I don't think you understand what you showed us yesterday." "I think I do. This isn't a ghost story. Gerald is sitting in that house right now. He's physical evidence. A neurologist could examine him. His medical records exist. The Coast Guard's patrol data is public record, I've already pulled it. You've got living people in this town who were affected. This isn't rumor or folklore, this is," he stopped, recalibrated. "This is documentable. We don't need to go into the stretch. We don't need to film the water. We film Gerald. We interview you, your father, Donna, anyone willing to talk. We pull the Coast Guard records. We bring in a neurologist. We make this the most important story in the country." My stomach folded in on itself, slow and cold. "You can't do that," I said. "We can. And Nora, I think we should. You've been keeping this secret for 30 years. Don't you want people to know? Don't you want someone to actually study this thing, figure out what it is, find a way to? To what? Stop it? Cure Gerald? Maybe. Maybe not. But at least to acknowledge it. To warn people properly instead of relying on fake lobster buoys and a prayer. He wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. Everything he was saying was reasonable and even compassionate, and it was going to get people killed. Because here's what Mark hadn't calculated: if this story aired, really aired, with evidence, with Gerald on camera, with Coast Guard data, every curious person with internet access and a boat would come to Greyhaven. Not tens. Hundreds. Thousands. The same impulse that makes people drive to disaster sites and haunted houses and radioactive exclusion zones would bring them here, except when they arrived, there would be no fence, no guard, no visible danger. Just open water that looked like every other stretch of ocean. And some of them would go in. Because that's what people do with a dare. And they'd come back less. Or they wouldn't come back at all, not in any way that mattered. And the stretch would still be there, indifferent, expanding. Telling the truth hadn't protected anyone. It had built the biggest possible billboard pointing straight at the danger. I spent that night on the makeweight, alone at the dock, listening to the water and trying to think. I called my father around 10. He picked up on the second ring, the way he always does, alert, immediate, as if he'd been waiting. I told him what Mark wanted to do. He listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your mother's name was Ellen. I know that because you've told me. I've seen her face in photographs 1,000 times. I don't recognize her. Not in any of them. I know I loved her because you say I did and I believe you. But I can't feel it, Nora. The feeling isn't hiding somewhere, it's not buried, it's not blocked. It was never there. That's what it's like. It's like it was never there." I'd heard him say versions of this before. It never got easier. "If people come," he said. "When they come. More of them will have this. Not about a wife. About everything." "I know, Dad. So what are you going to do?" I told him. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You'll lose things. I know. You might lose important things. I know that too." He didn't try to talk me out of it. He knew me well enough to know I'd already done the math, and he knew the math well enough to know I was right, and he knew that being right about this was the kind of thing that costs more than being wrong. I called Mark at midnight and told him I'd changed my mind. I said I'd take them out in the morning, on my boat, on my terms. I said I'd show them the stretch firsthand. He was surprised, then grateful, then excited. He thought I'd finally decided to cooperate. He had no way of knowing I was cooperating with a different plan than the one he thought we were making. We left the harbor at dawn. Flat calm, overcast, the kind of September morning where the ocean and the sky are the same shade of gray and the horizon dissolves into a band of nothing. Mark, Suki, and Dean were on the makeweight with their equipment. Suki had 2 cameras running, Dean had his sound rig with a boom and a digital recorder. They were quiet, professional, focused. Good at their jobs. About to be made unable to remember them. I drove the makeweight east around Greyhaven's southern point and up toward the stretch. The water looked like water. It always does. There's no line, no color change, no temperature gradient. No marker on any chart. Just ocean, featureless, ordinary, and then at some point you're inside it and the ocean is doing something to you that you can't see or feel until it's done. I knew the coordinates. I've memorized them, updated monthly, because you can't bring written information into the stretch and expect it to survive. A chart carried across the boundary will come out blank, the paper's there, the ink's there, but the content has been emptied the same way a memory is emptied. GPS units read normally inside, which has always struck me as grimly logical. The satellites are 120 miles above the surface. The stretch is in the water, not the sky. It doesn't reach that far. Not yet. We're inside, I said, when the GPS matched my numbers. I said it casually, the way you'd tell someone they'd crossed a county line. The 3 of them looked around. Nothing. Just ocean. Greyhaven's rocky eastern shore about a mile to the west. Open water in every other direction. Suki panned her camera slowly across the horizon. Dean held up his boom mic and watched his levels. Mark stood at the bow and scanned the water as if expecting something to surface. "I don't see anything," Mark said. "You won't." 5 minutes in, Dean checked his playback. He'd been narrating into the recorder since we crossed, date, time, position, conditions, the standard log he kept on every shoot. He put his headphones on and scrubbed back 30 seconds and listened. Then he took the headphones off and looked at the recorder as though it had malfunctioned. "I've got ocean noise," he said. "Waves, wind, engine. But no voice. I was talking the entire time and there's no voice on the recording." "Play it aloud," Mark said. Dean unplugged the headphones and let the playback run through the speaker. We could all hear it, the ambient sound of a boat on open water. The rhythmic chop of small waves against the hull. The low drone of the makeweight's engine. But no voices. Not Dean's, not mine, not Mark's call from the bow 30 seconds earlier. The waveform on the recorder's display showed flat line in the vocal range and normal amplitude everywhere else. "That's not possible," Dean said. "I'm right here. The mic is right here." Suki pulled her camera off the mount and reviewed the footage she'd been recording. The viewfinder still showed what her eyes could see, the boat, the crew, the water. But when she scrubbed back through the recorded files, the frames were empty. They existed, time-stamped, properly encoded, the correct resolution and frame rate, but they showed flat gray water. No boat. No people. No island on the horizon. As if the camera had been pointed at open ocean with no one aboard. "This is a hardware issue," Mark said, but he said it slowly, and halfway through the sentence he stopped. His mouth stayed open for a moment, and then he closed it, and his hand went to his forehead, and he looked at me with an expression I'd seen before, not in his face specifically, but in the faces of other people, in the moments after the stretch first touches something they're holding. "I was going to say something," he said. "I had a thought in it, I was holding it and then it wasn't there." "I know," I said. "No, you don't understand. I don't mean I forgot it. I mean it was taken. I could feel it go. I was watching the clock on the GPS 7 minutes. Dean set down his recorder and pressed his hands flat on the gunwale. "Mark. What's the name of our show?" Mark looked at him. "I know we have a show," Dean said. "I can see us filming it. I can remember being on shoots. But I can't, what's it called?" Mark opened his mouth and nothing came out. He tried again. He looked at Suki, who was staring at the camera in her hands as if it belonged to someone else. "Suki, what's the name of the show?" Suki didn't answer. She said, very quietly, "I don't remember how to get home from here." "We're on a boat," Mark said. "We get home by." "Not the boat. Home. Where I live. I know I live somewhere but I don't know the address. I can't see the building. I don't know what city I'm in. 11 minutes. I felt it too. I'd been bracing for it, holding tight to the things I needed, the coordinates, the way back, the purpose of being here, the how to run the engine. I'd stacked them in the center of myself like supplies in a storm cellar, and I was gripping them with everything I had. But the stretch doesn't take what you're gripping. It takes the other things. The things at the edges that you didn't think to protect because you didn't know they were there until they were gone. I reached for the name of the first boy I'd kissed. It had been there that morning. I was sure of it. Now there was nothing, not a blur, not a tip of the tongue sensation. Clean absence. A slot where a memory should have been, empty as a pulled tooth. I tried to picture my bedroom at age 12. The wallpaper, the window, the bedspread. Nothing. Not faded, not vague. Gone. I tried to remember what my mother's voice sounded like. That one I'd been losing to ordinary time for years, so I couldn't be sure whether the stretch took it or whether it had already been gone. But the fact that I couldn't tell the difference was its own kind of loss. 15 minutes. Dean was sitting on the deck, crying. Not sobbing, tears were running down his face and he was looking at them on his hands with what appeared to be genuine confusion, as if his body were doing something his mind couldn't account for. He didn't seem to know why he was upset. The emotion had outrun the context. Suki had set her camera down on the bench. She was staring at the water with an expression that wasn't quite empty, but was getting there. I recognized the early stage of it, not blankness but a reduction, a simplification, as if her face were losing its vocabulary of expression one word at a time. The beginning of Gerald's face. Mark was sitting on the gunwale, very still, looking at his hands. He turned them over, examining the palms, the backs, the fingers, with the careful attention of someone seeing them for the first time. I turned the boat. The makeweight came around smoothly. I'd run this boat in worse conditions than a flat calm, and I pushed the throttle forward. The coordinates in my head pointed west. The GPS confirmed it. The engine responded the way it always did. I drove us out of the stretch in 4 minutes, back into water that was ordinary in the way that water is supposed to be ordinary, inert, containing nothing, taking nothing. The crew stood on the dock at Gannet Harbor like people who'd woken up in a hotel room in a country they didn't remember traveling to. Mark had his phone in his hand and was staring at the screen, scrolling through contacts whose names he could read but couldn't connect to faces or relationships. He'd tap a name, stare at it, and scroll on. Suki held her camera against her chest. Her hands knew how to hold it, muscle memory, which lives deeper than the stretch reaches in a short exposure, but she couldn't explain why she had it or what she did with it. Dean was standing at the edge of the dock, looking at the water with his notebook open. His handwriting covered the pages, detailed notes, GPS coordinates, timestamps, words like Greyhaven and Coast Guard and Stretch and Gerald. He read them aloud, slowly, the way a child sounds out words in a language they haven't learned. "Why does this say, Greyhaven?" he asked me. "Is that where we are?" "You were on a location scout," I told them. "I chartered you out this morning. Conditions were bad, nothing usable. Happens sometimes. I'm sorry you came all this way." They accepted it. Not because it was convincing, it wasn't, really, not if you looked at it closely, but because they had nothing to construct a better story with. The raw material of their last 4 days in Gannet Harbor had been lifted out, and what remained was a vague sense of purpose and a set of notes that no longer connected to anything they could remember experiencing. Mark called his production office from the harbor parking lot. I could hear his side of the conversation, confused, halting, apologetic. He said the location had been a dead end. Nothing there. He said he didn't know why he'd been so excited about it. He could feel that he'd been excited, there was an emotional residue, like a stain, but the content was gone. His producer sounded annoyed. Mark apologized again and hung up and stared at the phone. They were packed and gone by 5 o'clock. I watched the rental car pull out of the parking lot and turn south toward the highway, and I stood there until I couldn't hear the engine anymore, and then I sat down on the dock. The harbor was quiet. A few lobster boats tied up at the far end, rocking gently in the last of the afternoon swell. Greyhaven sat on the horizon, dark and solid, and beyond it the stretch lay flat and gray and patient. I took inventory. Gone, the boy's name. My bedroom at 12. My mother's voice, though as I said, I may have already lost that. The smell of the first Thanksgiving dinner I cooked on my own, which I hadn't thought about in years and only noticed was missing because I'd been telling the story to a friend last month, and now the sensory part of the memory, the smell of sage and butter, was simply absent. The feel of the first time I drove the makeweight alone, the specific nervousness in my hands. The melody of a song my father used to sing while working on the dock, which I could remember him singing but could no longer hear in my mind. Those are the ones I found. There are others, I'm sure. That's the part you can't get around, you can only inventory what you remember having, and the things the stretch takes don't leave shadows. They don't leave holes you can feel the shape of. They leave nothing. You reach for a memory and the reaching just stops, the way a hallway stops at a wall. Still here, my father's face. His voice. The coordinates. The makeweight systems, the harbor layout, the channel depths, my license number, my social security number, my name. The important things. The operational things. The things I'd held onto by choosing to hold on to them. But I was lighter. I could feel it, a reduction in density, a thinning. Not physical, not metaphorical, somewhere in between. Like a house where someone has quietly removed the furniture from 3 or 4 rooms when you weren't looking, and now when you walk through them, your footsteps echo differently, and the spaces feel larger than they should, and you can't always remember what used to be there. I called my father. "It's done," I said. "They're leaving. They don't remember." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you lose?" I told him what I could identify. He listened to each one without comment. Then he said, "And what else?" "I don't know," I said. "That's the point, Dad. I can't know." "Yes," he said. "That's the point." We sat on the phone in silence for a while. I could hear the television in his room, low, some evening news broadcast. He said he was tired and was going to bed. I said I loved him. He said he loved me. I hung up and watched the sun go down behind Greyhaven and felt the absence in me like air in a room where a window has been left open, a draft, faint, coming from somewhere I couldn't quite locate. My phone buzzed. Email. I opened it, and the draft became a wind. It was from a company called Fathom Media, network affiliated, based in New York. The subject line referenced something called the Greyhaven Gap, a term I'd never heard, but which had apparently gained traction on a maritime anomaly forum I didn't know existed. They wanted to bring a crew of 6. They'd already filed FOIA requests with the Coast Guard for the patrol data around Greyhaven. They wanted to discuss charter availability for a shoot in late October. I read the email twice. Then I read it a third time, slowly, doing arithmetic. 6 people. Not 3. I'd need more time inside the stretch to make sure it took enough from all of them. More time means more cost. More rooms emptied. More hallways that echo. I thought about Gerald. Gerald went in once. One time, one day, and he'd been sitting in that recliner for 27 years with nobody home. I'd been close to the stretch several times over the years, checking the boundary, intercepting drifters, pulling a kayaker back last summer. And now I'd been inside it properly, for 20 minutes, willingly. Each exposure moved me closer to Gerald's chair. Not by much. But the distance between where I was and where Gerald was had a finite number of steps, and I'd just taken one. I could afford more. I was sure of that. My mind was still my mind, myself was still myself, the losses were peripheral, personal but not structural. I could do this again. Probably a dozen more times before I started losing the things that mattered, the operational skills, the recognition, the drive. Probably. I typed a reply, "Thanks for reaching out. I'd be happy to discuss charter availability. October works for me." I hit send. Then I opened my contacts and scrolled down to a name I'd been avoiding all evening. My daughter, Leah. 20 years old. Junior at the University of Southern Maine in Portland. She doesn't know about the stretch. She's never asked why the Coast Guard doesn't patrol Greyhaven's eastern shore, because she grew up in a town where you don't ask, and then she grew up out of the town entirely, and now she's studying environmental science and calling me on Sundays and living a life that has nothing to do with marker buoys or volunteer rotations or men sitting in recliners with nobody inside them. I'd kept it from her deliberately. Not because she couldn't handle it, Leah can handle anything, but because knowing is a weight, and I didn't want her carrying it. The weight is mine. The buoys are mine. The stretch is mine, in the way that a farmer's weather is theirs. You don't choose it, you don't control it, you just get up every morning and manage it, and the management is the life. I looked at her name on the screen. Leah Cahill. I could see her face, dark hair, her father's jawline, my eyes. I could hear her laugh. I could remember her at 6, riding on my shoulders at the 4th of July, and at 14, furious with me about something I could no longer recall, and at 18, driving away to college in a car packed so full she couldn't use the rear-view mirror. I could remember all of that. I could not remember the day she was born. I knew she'd been born, obviously, factually, she existed. I knew it had happened at the hospital in Rockport, because that's where everyone from Gannett Harbor goes. I knew it had been in March, because her birthday is March 14th. But the day itself, the drive to the hospital, the labor, the first time I held her, whatever she looked like in those first minutes, whatever I felt, was gone. Cleanly, completely, the way my father's memories of my mother were gone. Not faded, not buried. Absent. A slot where the most important day of my life should have been, empty, and nothing on either side of it reaching across the gap. I closed the phone. I looked at the water. The stretch was out there in the dark, invisible, indifferent, expanding at 30 meters a year. I started planning for October.